Hi, in this screencast we're going to talk about circulatory systems of the animal kingdoms, and we want to compare and contrast some of the different types. Maybe the number one focus that we want to have is understanding that the circulatory system is just a main part of the homeostasis of the various systems of the body and the organ systems of the body, because it transports so many things to and from all of the body cells. The purpose of the blood to be the transport system is necessary because of the exchange, the need for the exchange of materials. So there have to be materials that are going to be exchanged across cell membranes in all of the cells of their body for all of these purposes. Those are main ones, but just to name a few. So if you're a single-celled organism, like this paramecium, that's pretty simple. Remember the process of diffusion. Things move from where there's more of them to where there's less of them. If there are nutrient molecules on the outside of the cell, they will diffuse inside. If you have many cells, that's harder to get everywhere that you need to get. So there's limitations of simple diffusion. And with a transport system, a highly complex and just branching highway system or transport system, multicellular organisms are able to transport the number of materials that they need to get to each cell and from each cell. So the circulatory system needs to, of course, transport a number of different products, a number of different substances, a number of different molecules. And for the most part, it needs to transport really nutrient-type organisms to every single cell in the body, and it also needs to transport waste products from every cell in the body. So we can get more specific there, but you should stop this and just take a minute to review the number of things that can be transported by the circulatory system in the blood. Something that we want to be able to distinguish between are the types of circulatory systems that exist. So all circulatory systems have these three components. They have the fluid, which is simply named the blood. They have the tubes for the transport system, and then of course there's a muscular pump of some type. In an open circulatory system, these exist to some point, but not to the complexity of the closed circulatory system. So we want to look at each one of those a little closer. So an open circulatory system doesn't have a completely closed network or highway of tubes through which the blood is going to be transported. Invertebrates, namely, show or have an open circulatory system. So there's no separation really between the interstitial fluids, remember the interstitial fluids of the body tissues, and the blood itself. And really the fact that both the closed here and the open systems are each widespread among the animal kingdom suggests that there must be advantages to both. So in an open system, actually the lower hydrostatic pressures associated just kind of as having an open circulatory system as opposed to the high pressures in a closed tube, but this makes them less costly in terms of energy. Because they don't have an extensive system of blood vessels, they require less energy to build and maintain this. And even in some invertebrates, open circulatory systems can even provide some hydrostatic pressure itself to actually store, to support the body. Rather than kind of a rigid skeletal system, it kind of aids in maybe an exoskeletal system as well as just having some pressure against the internal tissues to help support the body itself. Closed circulatory system, of course, just by that nature, are going to have higher pressures because they're enclosed in a tight space. And there are some advantages to that. But simply, your higher vertebrates are going to all have closed circulatory system as well as some invertebrates. But the structure is just that the blood is concentrated, confined in this tubular system, and then separated from all of the tissues. And so typically material has to diffuse between the tissues, the interstitial fluid that surrounds all the tissues of a body, and the blood itself. So there's advantages there. A closed system, because there's higher blood pressure, are much more effective at transporting circulatory fluid, the blood, to meet the high demands of metabolism in the tissues and the cells of larger, more active animals. Only the large and active, like squids and the octopuses, have closed circulatory systems. So even though the demands to have a circulatory system might be higher in terms of energy, they also allow those higher animals to be more active and to more efficiently transport the things that are needed to be transported by a circulatory system. So even in the higher vertebrates, there's a difference in the closed system. Namely, that's the number of heart chambers. So, for instance, in the fish, which are closed circulatory systems, but the simple two-chambered heart is going to pump non-oxygenated blood through or to the gills itself, and then with the pump still behind that part of the tubulature, tubulature, is that a word? I don't think so, but I wonder if anybody's listening. So behind those capillary beds is where the force comes from. So the oxygenated blood actually isn't pumped that forcefully. So it's low pressure to all of the body, which for fish, they don't tend to really need or be that highly active. In amphibians, there's actually a three-chambered heart where it doesn't separate the blood, or in fact the non-oxygenated and the oxygenated blood mix before it's actually sent out of the heart. In a four-chambered heart, mammals, and like you and I, they're highly structured, and the advantages of that is that the heart is going to separate oxygen-rich from oxygen-poor blood, and it can efficiently pump oxygen-rich blood to all of the tissues and cells of the body where it's needed. So furthermore, with a four-chambered heart, the powerful four-chambered heart is essential for being endothermic. Remember, maintaining an internal body temperature as opposed to just basically going with the external environment, right? So the endothermic characteristic of mammals and birds uses roughly 10 times as much energy as kind of the same sized ectotherms. Therefore, the circulatory system then needs to deliver about 10 times as much fuel and nutrients and oxygen especially to all the tissues, and therefore, remove wastes and other carbon dioxide. So the large traffic of substances is made possible by keeping separate the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation, which is to the rest of the body. So a large, powerful heart is necessary for that huge volume of blood that mammals and birds need. So again, the advantages of the four-chambered heart are shown by selective forces that actually would eventually over time produce four-chambered hearts in birds and mammals, which descended from reptilian ancestors, but it's an example of convergent evolution here. So increase in body size, better protection from predation. You can get a bigger body, which in turn lowers predation. The endothermy, the ability to regulate one's own body temperature, although it takes a lot of energy, is going to increase the number of habitats to which organisms can adapt. And of course, flight with the birds, that helps them out to decrease the predation and increases their own ability to get food. So it does cost a lot. At the same time, this all kind of is packaged together. It also produces the benefits. We want to be familiar with a little bit of the anatomy of the circulatory system as well. The four-chambered heart that we're talking about, or the chambered heart that we're talking about, specifically four here with a mammal heart, the atria, there's a left atrium and a right atrium. a right atrium and a left atrium. Notice it's opposite because we're looking at the front or the anterior part of the heart. But the receiving chambers are the atria, the senders are the ventricles. Then the arteries are going to carry blood away from the heart. Arteries and veins are distinguished by the direction in which they carry the blood, not by the characteristics of blood that they contain. We often think that it has to do with oxygen rich or oxygen poor, but that's not the case. There's some notable exceptions to that. So the veins are going to bring blood back to the heart from the capillaries of the body tissues. And the arteries are going to carry blood away from the heart to those tissues. The arteries are going to branch into smaller arterioles until they branch in further down into the capillaries, which are really, really small, single cell thick walls. A significant exception to the rule I was talking about is really the hepatic portal vein, which carries blood from the capillary beds in the digestive system to the capillary beds of the liver, so that some screening, some waste and filtering of the blood can take place. Then blood flows from the liver back into the hepatic vein, which is going to go back eventually to the heart. The veins then also merge back into what are called venules before they actually will travel back into the two largest veins of the body, which are superior and inferior vena cava there. So as we just talked about, there's kind of the progression of the arteries from the heart branching into arterioles in the capillaries and then back getting larger. So here they are branching into smaller vessels, here they are merging back into larger vessels. The main point to know about arteries is that they're built for high pressure. There's a lot of pressure coming out of specifically the left ventricle of a four-chambered heart, and so they have thicker muscular walls, and they're also elastic, so that helps maintain the blood pressure even when the heart is in between specific contractions. Veins are thinner walled. They don't need to have quite the ability to withstand pressure because it's low pressure coming back from the tissues. Remember, at the capillaries, red blood cells are eking through like single file, so there's not a lot of pressure behind them. They do have valves in them which are able to help when the heart relaxes. They are able to slam shut, like the heart valves, and prevent the backflow of blood, to keep the blood going in its one-way direction back to the heart. And again, capillaries very thin, and they are built for exchange, for simple diffusion in the tissues. So quite traditionally, in talking about circulation, the blue is going to represent deoxygenated, or more realistically, oxygen-poor blood, where the red color is going to indicate oxygen-rich blood. And so we need to be familiar with systemic versus a pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary circulation involves blood flow from the heart to the lungs and back, and systemic circulation is going to be handled between the heart and all of the other body tissues. We want to become familiar with the blood flow through the body, so the circulation of both systemic and pulmonary circulation as overall transport system between the heart and the body. And we'll do this a little bit later. We'll come back and specifically go through that in another screencast. Inside of the heart we have what are called valves, and those valves, as you probably know, are going to prevent backflow. They're going to keep the blood flow in the correct direction. So the heart sounds are actually associated with these things. If you've ever heard in a stethoscope or heard a recording of the lub-dub heartbeat, you're actually hearing by the slamming shut of those heart valves that are caused by changes in blood pressure within the heart during the cardiac cycle. You can actually hear it without a stethoscope. You can put your ear up to somebody's chest, hopefully a pretty close friend, and you'll be able to hear that heartbeat. So the first sound, what's typically referred to as the lub sound, is actually formed or created by the recoil of the blood against these closed AV valves that are between cells, uniquely named UV valves, atrioventricular valves. And the second sound, the lub-dub, the dub comes from the recoil of blood against the semilunars. So you kind of know where blood is in the heart according to those sounds. So in the heart, you've got the blood flow, always atrium, ventricles, and then out. In the right side of the heart, oxygen poor blood comes into the atrium, pumped to the ventricle, and pumped out to the lungs. In the left-hand side of the heart, from the lungs comes into the left atrium, then into the left ventricle, and pumped out through what's called the aorta, branched into the upper body, and this descending aorta is going to take it throughout the entire body. And just notice, even in this drawing, that you can see how how much thicker the musculature is in the left ventricle than the right ventricle, because this needs to pump the blood throughout the entire body. The right ventricle only needs to pump it out, about a foot to either lung. So the cardiac cycle that I just mentioned is one complete sequence of pumping of the heart. And so it includes these things, and it specifically includes the systolic phase and the diastolic phase. So the contraction phase is called systole, and that's where the ventricles are going to pump out the blood, either to the lungs to pick up oxygen or to the entire body. And the relaxation phase is called diastole, and that is the point where the atria are going to actually fill with blood. So if you've heard of systolic pressure and diastolic pressure, the systolic pressure is what occurs, it's higher because it's what occurs when the musculature ventricles squeeze the blood out into the big arteries of the body. And the diastolic pressure is where the ventricles are actually relaxed. But of course, there still is a certain amount of pressure that is there. So we actually use that knowledge to be able to measure blood pressure. Measuring blood pressure is actually pretty easy. You take a blood pressure cuff, pretty cool, it's named a sphygmomanometer, if you can say that 5 times fast. I nailed it just now, somehow. But what we do is we fill it with air. It looks like one of those little things you'd put on kids when they go in the swimming pool. You fill it with air, and what it literally does is it compresses the brachial artery coming down through the upper arm, and it stops blood pressure. Then you slowly release the air, and as you can visually see this, at some point the pressure is going to be released enough so that blood can start to trickle through that artery again. And you can actually hear that when it starts to trickle through using a stethoscope. And so you can hear that point at which the blood starts to trickle through, and then as you continue to lower the pressure in the cuff, at some point the blood is actually going to be free flowing again, and you actually won't hear anything. Those are, if you ever listened to blood pressure, those little taps in there are called the sounds of Kratkov, and you can hear those appear and then disappear. But what it really tells you, what blood pressure really tells you, is how hard the heart is working. At a higher number, let's say you had a systolic pressure of like 180, which is high. That's hypertension. That's probably high blood pressure. That means that the blood is actually is coming through at a higher pressure. And really what that means is that your body is working, your heart is working harder than it really should. There we go. That's probably a little longer for a screencast, but we really want to make sure that we know really the advantages and disadvantages of the types of circulatory systems, really open and closed, and then even in the closed circulatory system, know the advantages and disadvantages of the different types of hearts, and then how that affects circulation through the entire body.